Greetings and welcome to episode 60 of Bible 180. We are on the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel from the book of Daniel. And let's recall for a moment the historical context of the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel. Takes place after the time of the divided kingdom when the 12 tribes of Israel had a family feud squabbling, and they split into two kingdoms, the northern and the southern kingdom. They were eventually decimated in the northern kingdom, and they assimilated themselves into the pagan culture around them and disappeared, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. And they knew that they had rejected God, which led to their destruction and their special standing with God. They had forgotten who they were and whose they were. In the southern kingdom of Judah, around the time 800 to 600 BC, there were good kings and there were a whole lot of bad kings. And in the end, in 605 BC, wicked King Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and sent the remaining people in Judah into captivity in Babylonia. It's called the Babylonian captivity, or the exile, or the deportation of the Jews. Sent them to Babylon about 800 miles away. It lasted, the Babylonian captivity, for about 70 years. The book of Daniel comes to us from the time of the Babylonian captivity, as does Esther, Jeremiah, and Lamentations that we'll be talking about. The southern tribe of Judah had been deported. They were in exile, in captivity to another nation. Thousands of Hebrews faced a culture shock of being moved from Judah and to Babylon. They became strangers in a foreign land, far from home. But wicked King Nebuchadnezzar was strong enough, or smart enough, to recognize the talents of some of his new deportees, and so he handpicked the brightest and the best to serve him, the people of Judah, as special advisors. From those Hebrews who were deported, King wicked Nebuchadnezzar chose some men who were, according to the first chapter of Daniel, young, without any physical defect, handsome, strong, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. 4 were chosen, 4 high-quality, high-caliber young men, handsome, and they were mentored by wicked King Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel was one of them, separated from the rest of his people for training under a pagan king. So in the first 2 chapters of Daniel, wicked King Nebuchadnezzar created a huge statue of himself, 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide, made a king's decree that all of the people there should bow down to it. That's in the first 2 chapters. In chapter 3, these 3 amigos, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused to bow down to the wicked King Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue because of their faith in the one true God. And that really ticked off wicked King Nebuchadnezzar, who ordered them to be thrown into the fiery furnace. But he was so mad that he told the people running the furnace masters, to crank it up to 7 times the normal temperature. In fact, when the soldiers who brought Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire to throw them in, they were toasted. They were killed by the heat that was, the radiant heat that was there. The soldiers threw them in and poof, they were gone. So the funny thing happened. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not burned. In fact, as King Nebuchadnezzar looked into the fiery flames, he not only saw the 3 amigos, but a 4th person walking among them, whom we think is an angel or the Holy Spirit. So King wicked Nebuchadnezzar pulled him out of the fire, and the flames hadn't touched them at all. They didn't have a single hair singed on their body, nor did they even smell like smoke. It's amazing what God can do, huh? In Daniel chapter 5, King Nebuchadnezzar meets with a rather unfortunate end to his kingship, as sometimes happen when wicked totalitarian kings turn against God. And by chapter 6, there's a new king called King Darius. At this time, Daniel was rising through the ranks of the Babylonian Empire. He was still a kingdom person from God, but he was doing his work where he was. Even while rising through the ranks, he became friends with King Darius and became the king's trusted confidant. And one Bible fact is that by the time Daniel appears on the scene here in Daniel chapter 6, he's 90 years old. He is an old geezer, 90 years old, serving the new king during the time of the Babylonian captivity. He's faithful in his work, that he kept getting promoted, and Daniel was soon in charge of the whole pagan government. Well, that promotion that Daniel got to be head of the whole government didn't sit too well with other cabinet members and high officials. In jealousy, they discredited Daniel by conducting an exhaustive background search on Google in order to dig up some dirt from his past. They vetted him. They looked at all of his college party pictures on Facebook and his Twitter feed, but they couldn't find any dirt on Daniel whatsoever. Their plan failed because Daniel was too much a man of integrity. So they decided that the only way that they could kind of thwart Daniel's rise to fame was use his religious convictions against him. So they contrived a devious yet ingenious plan. They appealed to the King Darius's pride by challenging him to issue a royal decree that could not be altered, that would result in the execution of anyone in the kingdom who would pray to any god other than King Darius. Now, Darius, being a small-minded man that he was, let his pride trap him. So Darius issued an unchangeable decree that everyone should worship him, and anyone who didn't worship him would be thrown into the lion's den. Little did he know that in issuing such an unchangeable decree, he would be endangering the very life of his trusted confidant, friend, Daniel. As expected, it took Daniel's peers no time to find him guilty of praying to his God, and then they convicted him of violating a king's decree and ordered him to be thrown into the lion's den, all apart from the king's personal desires, but he had issued the decree. They had Daniel and Darius on a legal technicality, and Daniel had to be thrown into the lion's den. So for Daniel, man, oh man, life seemed to be now close to an end without hope. He's in the lion's den. He's there because he violated the king's decree that could not even be revoked by the king himself. There was a stone rolled on top of the lion's den to keep Daniel in there. No physical way for Daniel to escape. Of course, it reminds us of the stone that was rolled against the tomb of Jesus. And on top of that, with that stone, there was placed a royal seal on to make the den with the stone secure. In Daniel 6, we read, "The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed." So the king and his nobles, they took clay or wax, and they sealed it over the stone, pressed in their signet rings into the clay, so that if someone did try to save Daniel, they would first have to break the seals, which would have brought on them the decree of their own execution. So every precaution was made to make sure that the deliverance of Daniel was humanly impossible. No one going to be able to rescue Daniel, not even the king. Daniel's close relationship with the king made no difference now. There was nothing the king or King Darius could do, even though Daniel was his friend. But something else was happening while Daniel was in that den. Here's what happened. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent of his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong with you, O king." And then the words. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted. He had trusted in his God. No false gods, no Babylonian worship pagan deities, but Daniel's God, creator of the universe and God and Father of us all. The ending of the story is even maybe the greatest miracle of all. King Darius, king of the wicked and evil Babylonians, when he saw what had happened and how Daniel had witnessed to his faith in God, wrote a letter to the entire evil Babylonian empire and every language, to be read in every language in the world at that time, that says, Darius says, "I make a decree that all my royal dominion people should tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, enduring forever, for his kingdom shall never be destroyed and his dominion have no end." The wicked king Nebuchadnezzar of Darius of Babylon ordered that all the people be converted to the God of Israel. And just like the conversion of Nineveh, like we'll talk about in the next episode or two from Jonah, the wicked Babylonian Empire turned their hearts to God, which set the stage for their return to Jerusalem, their return home, to rebuild the temple and get back their God-given land. You see, all of that time of those 70 years of the Babylonian captivity, God was preparing his people to go back to Jerusalem. Even though everything seemed to be lost and without hope, God was preparing his people to return. Because God is sovereign, God is king, God will do what God will do, and that's the message we get from Daniel. So sometimes it's important for us to remember that when we feel like we're in a lion's den, when we feel like there's no hope, that all our get up and go is got up and went, and there's nothing we can do in a situation where like that. We're suffering, we're depressed, we're without hope. Think of this. Researchers have shown that the main factor that causes people to give up when they go through hard times is not the intensity of their struggling or their suffering, but rather their belief that their suffering has no meaning. It's not the suffering itself, but that the suffering has no meaning. It's not the pain that they go through that causes them to give up, but it's the meaninglessness of it. Researchers who study these kind of things find even suicide notes rarely talk about failing health or rejection or finances or even physical pain. Rather, those notes say things like, "There's no point in going on. There's no reason for me to keep living." That's why the guy who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, "If anyone smiles at me, I won't jump." Nobody smiled at him, and he jumped. That's why I encourage you to smile. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were able to endure the fiery pit and the king's den because they knew in God's sovereignty. They knew that God would bring them through. I think that's an attitude that we need to always remember. God is with us, even in the midst of difficult things that we go through. Finally, about Daniel, remember that the Bible, especially the Old Testament, well, New Testament, of course, too, but the Old Testament points to Jesus. During the time of the exile and captivity, the language of Aramaic was developed. Aramaic was developed in Babylon. The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was written in Aramaic, not Hebrew like the rest of the Old Testament. it was written in Aramaic. It was a language developed during Daniel's time. Aramaic was the language that Jesus spoke. The language of Aramaic was the one that the Sermon on the Mount was written in, and the Lord's Prayer. Those are the only portions of the New Testament that are written in Aramaic rather than Greek, because Aramaic was developed during the time of the exile and was the language of Jesus. And also during the time that Daniel was promoted, his final title was Chief of the Wise Men, Chief of the Magi. Daniel was the chief of the wise men. Hundreds of years later, after Daniel, wise men would come from the east, from Babylon, from the culture that Daniel created in Babylon. They would one day come and bow down in front of Jesus, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. God was preparing his people to return to Jerusalem in Babylon during that time of captivity. So the question is, who will we follow? The lion of King wicked Nebuchadnezzar, or the lion of God, the roaring lion of Satan that leads to a destructive path for our lives, or the lion of the tribe of Judah, which is Jesus? It's a fascinating story, this story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I hope you have gotten some good insights from that. And just remember, every day is a day to wake up and serve God, to say it's going to be, no matter if everything goes well or not, it's going to be a great day. I look forward to being with you at the next episode, and until then, you take care. Bye-bye.